Hey there, so this video is for my junior woodworkers, and I'm here to show you how to set up your router table to cut slots on where you drew your lines. Now, regardless of whether you're making grooves, dados, or rabbets on the router table, it's really important that you unplug the router table before you do any adjustments. It's also important to make sure that you've properly unplugged it by trying to turn the router table on. The fact that it's not turning on means I'm good to make my adjustment. After you've unplugged the router, you're going to clamp one end of the fence using one of these clamps. Take your clamp, rotate it so it's upside down, grab the silver ratchet, and you can move it up and down. Have the clamp upside down like this, slide the silver ratchet down, grab the red handle, and spin it clockwise or to the right to tighten it. If you did this right, you would only have one clamp on one side and no clamp on the other side. We're going to clamp this side later. Now, regardless of what type of slot you're doing, your next step is to make sure that you have put the correct router bit into the router. I've created a separate video on how to change router bits, and I've included a link in the description below. But for the purposes of this video, you're looking for a straight bit where the profile is a rectangle and the top kind of looks like this. So this is good for slotting. This one can be used for slotting, and this one could be used for slotting. And of course, the one in here could also be used for slotting. This one here clearly doesn't have a rectangular profile, so probably not for slotting. On top of making sure that your router bit has the right profile, it also needs to be the correct size. And the size of the router bit depends on the type of slot that you're trying to make. For example, if I wanted a 3/4 inch slot, then this router bit needs to be 3/4 of an inch. To figure out the size of the router bit, you're going to look at it and you're going to measure the distance from this point here to this point here. So you grab your ruler and you measure that distance. So the distance from here to here is 3/4 of an inch. So this is the correct router bit. The next step is to determine how much of this router bit is sticking up from the table. That distance is dependent on how deep you want your slot to be. In my situation, I want my slot to be 1/4 inch deep, which means this router bit must be sticking up from the table by 1/4 of an inch. To adjust the height of this router bit, you're going to need a crank that looks like this, and it goes into this hole right over here. If you spin it clockwise, the router bit goes up, and if you spin it counterclockwise, the router bit goes down. Since we need our slot to be 1/4 inch deep, you want to look at the router from the side, and you want to keep your eye on this point here. You're also going to need a ruler. At this current moment in time, this router bit is going to cut a slot that's 5/8 deep. That's way too deep. We need 1/4 of an inch. So this tip here needs to be right down at 1/4 of an inch. So now it's at a 1/2 inch. And now it's at 1/4 inch. Now my router bit is set to cut a slot that's 1/4 inch deep. With the height set, we get our ruler, we put it away, and we also take our crank, we pull that out, and we put that away. Once we've got the height figured out, the next step is we're going to determine how far back or how far forward this fence should be. The distance of how far the fence should be is dependent on where you want to put your slot. Your next step is to hand rotate the router bit. So there's this point here of the router bit, and you need to make sure that this point is facing right up against the fence. So I'm going to rotate it. And now this point here is pointing towards the fence. Having the point facing the fence will help you get the most accurate slot location. Next, You want to look at the edge. You take your piece of wood and you put it right up against the fence over here, and then you keep your eye on this point here, and you want to move the fence so that this line lines up with the edge of that router bit there. Perfect. Now that you've got your fence set up in the right place, you're going to grab the other clamp and you're going to clamp that end of the fence. Make sure your clamp is upside down like this. Slide this silver thing down and twist clockwise or right to tighten. And you're going to keep spinning that red handle until it's nice and tight. You know you've done a great job when you shake the fence and it doesn't slide back and forth. I just want to show you this example over here. It's really obvious that the fence is super crooked. And I just want to reassure you that as long as the two clamps are really tight, when you run it through the router, the line or the slot will still be straight. So it's okay if your fence is crooked. You're also going to need a backing board or a backing stick. Your backing board or your backing stick should be completely flat and that there aren't any like chewed up sections, especially where you're cutting your slot. That backing board goes right up against the edge of your project, right behind it. If you don't have a backing board when you're doing a dado, you're going to get something called tear out along the edges. Tear out looks like this, and it occurs when chunks of wood are ripped from the edges. Having a backing board pressed up against the wood will help you prevent tear out. With the router set up, you're now ready to cut your slot.